From foreign buyer bans, mortgage defaults on the rise, a scam in the Montreal real estate market, and one Canadian city where it takes 96% of the average household income just to own a house there. It's been a very busy week in the Canadian real estate market and in this week's Canadian real estate news. My name is Matthew 𝗲𝗲𝗄. That's my trusted assistant Matilda. It's Friday. It's time to get you up to date. But as always, we're going to start off with a terrible bad dad joke. What does a house wear? A dress. If you have a terrible joke that I can use in a future episode of 𝗲𝗲𝗄 Real Estate, put it in the comments below. Let's get into the news. This first story comes out of Montreal, and it's a pretty interesting little scam that these two individuals are running. You may have had this before, heard of this, where somebody drops off a letter in your mailbox and says, I'll buy your house for cash. It'll be a quick and easy deal. Well, that's what these two individuals would do. Is predominantly they were looking for homeowners they felt were in financial trouble, offer them a quick, easy way to get their house sold. Of course, no commissions paid to a realtor, save a bunch of money. Essentially what these individuals would do is they would give you basically a down payment for the sale of the house. And then they said they would take the house, they renovate it, flip it out. And once they had done all that and resold it, you'd get the balance of that payment. That right off the bat should be raising some red flags why you're not getting payment in full at the time of sale. Well, then what these two individuals would do is they would go and they would get a private mortgage on the property, never do any of the renovations. They wouldn't sell the property, wouldn't pay the mortgage back, nothing. They just take the cash and run. And of course, then the private lender would then go and foreclose on the house. Well, the original seller never got that last payment. And now we're into a whole big pile of a mess. The Montreal police are investigating this, but this is one of those seller beware. If it sounds a little fishy, it probably is. This next piece is a report from RBC, and I've seen this reported everywhere. The headline is awesome or terrible, depending how you want to look at it. It takes in Vancouver 96% of the average household's income to own a house in Vancouver. And like I talked about when National Bank put out a stat like this, yes, when you take average income and divide it by the average cost of ownership, that's how you're going to get to 96% Vancouver and like 85% in Toronto and a whole bunch of other crazy numbers. But the fact is, this is not what's actually happening in reality. Let's just take a step back for a second and look at this. Let's say it actually does take 96% of a household's income to own a house in Vancouver. Well, they're not buying any groceries, they're not eating anything, and your auto loans, credit cards, all that line of credit, everything else, the delinquency rate and default rates on that would probably be at 100% because nobody can pay anything else and nobody's buying any groceries. Or delinquency rates and everything else in those cities would be sky high. Neither of those we're seeing in reality. So I get it. I know how the math works. I know how they came about it. And I get the sentiment. They're saying that housing is more expensive than it's ever been. That's absolutely true. But that 96% of one's income, well, that's just not actually what's happening. Well, let's talk about inflation, which is still stubbornly high, but it is trending down. 2 months ago, 6.9, last month, 6.8. So we're going in the right direction. But boy, is it staying sticky and stubbornly high. Of course, the Bank of Canada is insistent. They want inflation at 2%, and they're going to do whatever they have to do to get us there. It does appear that things are starting to continuing, I should say, to trend in that right direction. But boy, it's taken a long time. One of the big components of inflation is rent, and it's increasing at the fastest pace in 30 years. Rent's going through the roof. But I keep hearing, oh, there's no supply problem for housing in Canada. Well, then please explain to me, how are we having rent increasing at the fastest pace in 30 years if we don't have a supply problem in Canada? I think at this point, anybody who's telling you we don't have a supply problem just simply isn't looking at what's actually happening. We don't have enough houses in Canada, whether it's people wanting to buy or people needing a place to rent. There's a supply shortage across the country. Now let's talk about Canada's foreign buyer ban. This is on the news right now because the regulations just got announced, interestingly, a couple of weeks later than they were supposed to come out and right before Christmas. I think that's going to tell you all you need to know about how much the government really cares about this legislation. I'm going to get a little bit more into that in a second, but let's talk about who this affects and what it does. First off, what they're determining as a foreign resident is somebody who is not a Canadian citizen or not a permanent resident of Canada. So anybody who fits in those first two categories, you can continue to buy property in Canada, no problem. Then the property types that are included in this ban is anything that is 3 or fewer units. So single family houses, condos, etc. If you're a foreign national, you want to buy a 4-plex or bigger, go right ahead, no problem at all. Government doesn't care about that. Then the locations that properties are included is basically two, either a CMA or a CA. CMA is a census metropolitan area, that's your bigger cities, and your CAs are your smaller towns. CAs are 10,000 or more, CMA is 100,000 or more. This was put in because they were trying to not have properties that are vacation properties, cottage country, that type of thing, included in the ban. But this also means that the smaller centers, so for example, in my province, there's only about 5 areas that would be considered under this ban list. Everything else would be free game. So kind of interesting that they put those exemptions in. Then there's a pile of people that are exempt from this. First off is international students, but there is some caveats. They have to be studying, have been in Canada for so many years. Max purchase price is $500,000. So no more international students with no income buying multi-million-dollar properties. They're putting an end to that. Temporary foreign workers as well. They have to have been in Canada for a set period of time or filing income tax. Refugees are exempt, as are foreign nationals that are buying property, but they have diplomatic missions here in Canada. Those are all exempt people. But there's also a couple of things that I find really interesting about this. First off, when the government was asked whether they had done any sort of studies on the impact this would have on the Canadian real estate market, the answer was no, they hadn't done any studies at all. Now, you would think that if this is supposed to be a very important piece of legislation that's going to have a major impact on the Canadian real estate market, you would have done some sort of impact study on this, but they didn't. Now, CMHC has looked at what percentage of the market is foreign buyers, and in their data, they're showing it's about 4% of the market. That's nationally, of course. In Toronto and Vancouver, it's much higher, and especially in the downtown condo markets, I think I saw about 10 or 11%, so it's much more important in those centers. But interesting, the government didn't study this at all to see what impact it would have. Then, both property rights and real estate are provincial jurisdiction and regulated provincially. So at some point here, I fully expect somebody's either going to challenge this legislation or maybe even the province to say, hey, you're stepping on our territory here. We'd like the courts to have a look at this. And I think that's going to be a really interesting court case. I don't think this is the last we've heard of this foreign buyer ban. And finally, there's that sunset clause in this, which means in 2 years, this is no longer applicable, which lines up exactly the right time that a government would want to have an election and use this as a re-election campaign platform. That's just what my thoughts are, why I think this is more political theater than actual substantive policy the government wants and thinks is going to have any real meaningful impact. Speaking of the Canadian real estate market, have you checked out my most recent Canadian real estate monthly market update? Right here, check that one out if you haven't already. As always, guys, please like this video. If you like this content, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Leave comments. I love chatting with you guys in that comment section below. And thanks very much for watching.